I want to get started with this story about African-American college students having difficulty graduating from college. Again, having been through this and having been an academic advisor in higher education, I can tell you there's a couple of things that is mentioned in this article that are very much true, but I also want to talk about possible solutions, not just what the problems are. So let's go ahead and get into this discussion. Now, this was reported by CNN. Black students are less likely to attain college degrees because of discrimination and external responsibilities. Now, this is according to a new study. Let's go ahead and get into it. Ain't nothing to it but to do it. Give it to me one more time. Black college students have lower 6-year completion rates for any type of degree or certificate program than any other racial or ethnic group because of racial discrimination, the high cost of education, and a multitude of external responsibilities. Now, this is from the Lumina Foundation Gallup 2023 State of Higher Education study. That's where this is coming from. Here we go. The study released on Thursday found that Black students in less racially diverse programs are more likely to feel discriminated against, physically and psychologically unsafe, and disrespected, leading them to abandon their higher educational goals. Let me explain what this may be like for some of you wondering. I went to public university for undergrad. I went to a private university for grad school. There was a difference, big difference. Undergrad was more diverse, grad school, not so much. But even in the undergraduate school, oftentimes I was usually one of 2 Black people in my classes. Sometimes I was the only one, even in the public school. Sometimes these things would happen where, some of these professors, they mean well, but, they do weird things. Like, they're talking about a subject matter that involves the African American community, or it may involve an African American historical figure, or just something that deals with Black culture. And because you're the only one in the class, sometimes it's like they would just automatically point to you, whether you had your hand raised or not, as if you are the spokesperson for all Black people in America. Those kinds of situations, for me, it was just very uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. And what was even more worse, like all the kids in the class would turn around and look at me as if I had all the answers when it came to Black issues. And I didn't have all the answers. I was 18 years old. I had just left my parents' house, and I had an experience that a lot of people in my family did not have, me in the sense that I grew up in a different country and then we came back to the United States. So my experience was different. And the issues that were being discussed, I actually hadn't experienced personally. So it was just interesting that a lot of these professors, and it was mainly the white ones, they would just assume that I had that same experience because of the color of my skin, and that I was supposed to be the one that was going to answer these questions for everybody else in the class. It put a level of responsibility on me that I really did not want and I did not ask for. And it made it to the point where sometimes even my classmates, if there was a question about like Black community, Black culture, or a Black person, they would always come to me as if I had all the answers. So those are some of the examples. But again, it's important to remember I was 18 years old. It's just like, I was still kind of like a kid in a sense, but expecting me to be able to answer all those things. That's one of the psychological issues I had to deal with. Let's go on. Only 35% of Black Americans have associate degrees or higher, which are essential for economic and social mobility. And Black student enrollment has also declined over the last 10 years. Now, part of this has to deal with student loans, especially like the younger generations. Some of the younger, especially like the Gen Z, they are not really wanting to take out student loans because they don't want the student loan debt. So that's part of that problem. The data is sad and distressing, but the fact that we now have data, we can't hide and say we don't know anymore. That's coming from Courtney Brown, who is Lumina's Foundation Vice President of Strategic Impact and Planning. Now we need to act on the data. Although some well-paying jobs do not require a college degree, they still ask for certification and training. The study found that 32% of Black respondents in short-term credential programs reported feeling discriminated against at least occasionally compared to those in associate degree programs and bachelor's programs. The study also found that 34% of Black students at private for-profit institutions are more likely to report discrimination than those at public or private, not-for-profit institutions. I want to add something here. Just because it's not reported doesn't mean it's not happening. So there's that. People are more likely to report it at these private for-profit institutions because oftentimes these are programs that are online where you may not actually have to, have any type of interaction with the faculty member in person. A perfect example of that is a school like University of Phoenix. You guys remember University of Phoenix? Like you see the commercials all the time. That is an example of a private for-profit institution. Those schools are a ripoff, by the way. They're a big scam. They charge you way more than you should be charged for a lot of those classes if you went to a public university. But sometimes people go to those schools because it makes it more flexible. So like they can have the online option, they can do part-time, they can do full-time, like that kind of thing. That's how they get you, actually. That's how they get you. Moving along. This is especially concerning because Black Americans primarily attend private for-profit institutions and are spending a lot of money and time on credentials that they may not be able to receive. That is very true. I told you, those schools are very expensive, overcharged. If Black individuals aren't able to access these programs because they're being discriminated against, that's not good for the individual and it's not good for our society. Black bachelor students are twice as likely, 36%. Why did this pop up? 36% as other bachelor students, 18%, to have additional responsibilities as caregivers or full-time workers, according to the study. Let's chat about that for a second. This is very much true. I can tell you, again, when I was in undergrad, even as a freshman, I had a part-time job. Most of my white friends did not. Not necessarily because they didn't want to have a part-time job. They didn't have to have one. I had to have a part-time job. My parents helped with as much as they could when it came to college. And then I also took out student loans. But when it came to other things that I needed to pay for, I had to pay for those things on my own. I had to pay for my own books. And here's another piece that I think some people may not be aware of as well. It's also not uncommon for Black college students to be first generation college students. What does that mean? It means you're the first one in your family to go to college. So if you're the first one in your family to go to college, there are other financial responsibilities that you may have to deal with that you're not prepared for because no one in your family has actually, went to college. So they don't know to prepare you for that. And I'll give you some examples of that as well. Even for people that I knew that had a scholarship and maybe they had a part-time job. Well, the scholarship, let's say it covered everything, right? But there were other expenses that you had to deal with. For example, some of these classes required you to purchase materials outside of your textbooks that you need for the class. I had to take a speech class when I was in undergrad. It wasn't even a choice. It was required. We all had to take it. I had to buy a suit. These are the kind of things you may not be prepared for if no one in your family has been. So if you don't have a lot of money and you're on financial aid and you have to work and have to have the part-time job and all those types of things, when those types of expenses come up, those things can also make it difficult for you to do well in college, thus graduating and getting a degree. It's things like that that I saw that would hold people back, not being able to afford to buy a suit, not being able to attend some of these seminars that would actually help you with the class and actually would help you network, because those seminars cost too much money and your parents couldn't pay for it and neither could you. Even when you look at a university like Harvard, it's not just about going to Harvard. Everyone I know that went to Harvard also told me, even at Harvard, they had to network. It was about these social organizations that they joined. Some of these seminars abroad that were offered that they had to pay to go to. These seminars cost thousands of dollars. So if you don't have the money or the wealth to do the networking and get the other materials that you need for these courses, it is going to be more difficult for you to finish and graduate on time with your competing peers. And that's what people have to fully understand. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but it will be more difficult for you. Moving on. The study recommends that providing childcare on campus, increasing financial aid and scholarships, and providing more flexibility in coursework can help these individuals finish their degrees. Flexibility is part of the problem as well, because I'm sorry, but some of these professors aren't willing to be flexible. Some of these professors are not willing to give you flexibility. I had a classmate, her mom passed away. You think our professor cared? Our professor was like, no, paper is due on Friday. Things like that. Let's go on. The study also recommends that more people of color be placed in leadership positions at educational institutions to minimize feelings of discrimination. And institutions and policymakers need to ensure curriculums are inclusive and campus conduct policies spell out zero tolerance for discrimination. Look, I worked in higher ed for over a decade, and I can still tell you this piece is very crucial. Not having other African Americans in leadership positions at these universities is a big part of the problem. A big part of the problem. So what? Some of your classmates may be Black, just like you. If you're looking around and all the faculty members are white and all the deans are white, this may not put you in the best position to do well at this university. There are certain things that happen, sometimes cultural things that happen, that your faculty members and the dean just, it's not necessarily that they don't care, but they just don't understand because it's not a part of their culture, and they may not be as sensitive to it, so to speak. There's just certain things they may not get. Perfect example, during the pandemic, when I was working at Boston University and the school closed, and the students were either told to go back home to their parents' house or they had to stay in the dorm. Obviously, most of them chose to go back home. Here's the problem that we ran into. For a lot of the students that were coming from more of these wealthy families, and there are a lot of them that go to BU, they were all set. They had high-speed internet. They had their own room back at home. Like, they had the space and the resources that they needed to get the work done remotely. What I noticed is that when it came to particularly the African-American students, they struggled during this period, whereas they were not struggling when they were there on campus. And some of them struggled because back home, they didn't have their own room. Back home, they may have shared a room with a brother or a sister or multiple siblings. Back home, they didn't have high-speed internet. Back home, some of these kids didn't have broadband. These were the kind of things that the deans in charge did not think of because they don't come from that world. They're not coming from the Bronx. They're not coming from these inner city neighborhoods where these resources are not readily available. That's what happens when you don't have people in those positions who have the cultural experience. So that was something that I really noticed, is that they just did not seem to be understanding about that not everyone has a space where they can learn remotely, free from distraction. And not everyone has high-speed internet either. We need to talk about these things. It's a problem. Moving on. There needs to be somebody that's not only going to listen, but take action on that and not dismiss it. Far too many students have tried to report things and it's been dismissed based on the color of their skin, their age, and gender. And I will also add, along with that, you can also include sexual assault allegations too. Because this is another problem that happens at these universities. Students will report it and nothing is done. And instead of the perpetrator leaving the university, oftentimes it's the victim that has to end up leaving the university, because the university is going to protect the university. They're not really there trying to protect the victim. I don't care what type of organizations that they have in place at these universities. They have them all. Title IX, Wellness Center. Yeah, those institutions, they're there, they're in place, and you can go and talk to them. But at the end of the day, does that mean that you are going to get justice? Not necessarily, based on what I've seen. So there have been multiple things over time where I've seen students have made reports and nothing was done, whether it was sexual assault, whether it was racial, whether it was gender bias, whether it was, other violent behavior. I've seen this happen multiple times and nothing was done. Let's go on. Although the study does not explicitly mention historically Black colleges and universities, Brown acknowledged that these institutions are essential in the higher education system. She said that having people who look like them as peers, mentors, faculty, and administrative positions help Black students feel a sense of belonging, leading them to persist through their education. HBCUs are a gold star in this field, but it's not up to HBCUs. It's up to all institutions to ensure that they are inclusive, that they don't discriminate against any individual, that they provide a welcoming environment, and that they are working to ensure the success of every single student that they enroll. And not to mention, not everyone can get into an HBCU either. It's not like they have seats for all Black people to come to the university. But I think these are some of those things that you find out when you go through this, when you have this experience. I mean, these were things that I noticed, when I was in undergrad. By the time I got to grad school, I was, I knew what to expect. But freshman year was pretty tough. It wasn't tough academically. I was always great with school. It was tough financially and even socially, because there were just these things that you were just not prepared for. Again, if you're a first generation college student, that you had to deal with. So I think, what could they do to make things better? Again, I think it is important that they do have African Americans in some of these leadership positions. That's a big red flag. This is something you should notice if you're younger and you're watching this and you're going to your college tours, trying to decide which one you want to go to. Pay attention to who's in the leadership positions. Pay attention to that, because that can tell you a lot. That can tell you a lot. But that's something that can change to help. That is to diversify some of those leadership positions, but also students need to be heard and people need to be held accountable. And so if students are coming to higher ups in these administrative fields and they're reporting incidents of racial discrimination, or they're reporting incidents, let's add sexual assault in here as well, there needs to be some type of accountability. And oftentimes, based on what I've seen over 10 years, I didn't see those things happen.